We're really, stuck and there's no fuel. New York, 11 September 2018. High in the sky, Air India 101 approaches John F. Kennedy International Airport for a second attempt to land. The plane has just suffered several critical instrument failures. After a 14-hour flight, they are running low on fuel. They have also lost the ILS, the device that helps pilots land the plane, especially in bad weather. It's raining heavily outside the cockpit, and there are clouds all around. The pilots are flying blind, and it's almost impossible to see the runway. They are burning more fuel by the minute, and now they have to land. The lives of 357 people on board now depend on what the pilots do in the next few minutes. Were they able to avoid another 9/11 tragedy in New York? Let's find out. This is the story of Air India Flight 101. It's a warm autumn night at New Delhi's Indira Gandhi International Airport. 342 passengers and 15 crew were preparing for their 14-hour flight to New York. The U.S. is a popular destination for Indian students and tourists, and the plane was at maximum capacity. This flight from Delhi's IGY to New York's JFK is Air India's flagship route. This flight would take passengers on the polar route, flying over the rugged terrain of Pakistan, Russia, Finland, Greenland, and Canada before entering the U.S. The aircraft used for today's flight was a Boeing 777-300ER, a long-range twin jet. It's powered by two GE 9011-15B engines. This aircraft was first delivered to Air India in 2009 and has been in service for over 9 years. The 777 can be flown by two pilots, but as this flight lasted 15 hours and covered some 12,000 kilometers, the AI-101 had 4 pilots. 2 were the main crew and the other 2 were the support crew. The commander was Captain Rustam Pia, a 49-year-old with 3,500 hours on the type. With him in the cockpit were Captain Vikas, Captain Shashant Singh, and Captain D.S. Buddy. It's the first time the 4 of them have flown together. During the pre-flight briefing, the engineers reported that the flight's auxiliary power unit, APU, was not working. The APU on an aircraft such as the Boeing 7730ER is not normally considered critical to the safe operation of the aircraft. While the APU provides auxiliary power to various aircraft systems when the main engines are not running, it is not a primary propulsion system. Therefore, the pilots agreed that this was not a critical issue and decided to continue their flight to New York. With the possibility of bad weather in the forecast, the captain decided to load an extra 800 kilos of fuel to take them to an alternate airport if necessary. This decision proved to be crucial. The crew then requested pushback and taxi clearance, and the aircraft departed Delhi at 0300 local time, about an hour late. The takeoff itself was uneventful. The first signs of trouble came 40 minutes into the flight, over Pakistani airspace and just after reaching 30,000 feet. A warning message appeared on the pilot's screen saying single source radio altimeter. A radio altimeter is like a magic ruler for aircraft, telling them how high they are above the ground. It does this by sending invisible waves down to the ground and timing how long it takes for them to come back. This helps pilots land safely and fly at the right altitude. The Boeing 777, like many modern commercial aircraft, has 3 radio altimeters for redundancy and safety. This is so that if one radio altimeter fails, the aircraft can rely on the other 2 to provide accurate altitude information. But what this aircraft was telling the pilots was that 2 radio altimeters had failed and only one was working. The problem was, how can you be sure that the one altimeter that is working is giving you the correct altitude? Well, this isn't a problem when cruising, because when cruising you use a different type of altimeter called a barometric altimeter. The barometric altimeter uses air pressure to determine how high you are above sea level. It works on the principle that air pressure decreases with altitude. However, it is less accurate than the radio altimeter. The radio altimeter becomes very important when accurate altitude information is critical, such as when taking off and, more importantly, when landing. Keep this in mind for now. We'll come back to it soon. Fast forward 10 hours and the flight is now crossing the Atlantic Ocean. This is where the second problem appeared. There were still 3 hours to go before landing in New York. The pilots received a warning that their TCAS system was not working. TCAS, the traffic collision avoidance system, is like a smart traffic cop for planes. It uses radar to see other planes in the sky, and if two planes get too close, it tells the pilots of each plane to either climb or descend to avoid a collision. The loss of TCAS itself was again not a major concern, as it was a backup system during cruise to prevent collisions. However, it's a handy wingman during takeoff and landing when you're usually flying in crowded airspace and your workload is very high. This began to worry the crew, as it's unusual for unrelated instruments to stop working. The APU was not working before takeoff, the radio altimeter failed shortly after takeoff, and now the TCAS was failing. What worried them was whether there was some unknown problem with the aircraft that was causing all these failures, but there was not much they could do, so they continued on to New York. It's now about 10 minutes past 6 in the morning in New York. The weather was overcast with rain and clouds. The METAR indicated a visibility of a quarter statute mile for runway 04 right and a vertical visibility of 200 feet. AI 101 entered New York airspace and contacted the approach controller. Good morning, Air India 101 Heavy. Good morning, you're following traffic on short final runway 04R, RVR 3000, runway 04R cleared for landing. 04R cleared to land. After being cleared to land on runway 04R at JFK, the pilots attempted to use their ILS to capture the localizer and glide slope to guide them to the runway. But try as they might, the ILS simply wasn't picking up the localizer signals. Their instrument landing system had also failed. The ILS is very helpful to aircraft when landing. It uses special radio signals and antennas on the runway to guide the plane safely down, showing the pilots where to go and how high they are. It's like following invisible lines in the sky to make sure the plane lands smoothly, especially in bad weather. On this plane, the ILS didn't lock onto the signals sent from the runway. The crew then manually guided the aircraft to the correct heading and then tried what's known as an LNAV-VNAV approach. An LNAV-VNAV approach uses GPS, similar to what you have in your car to get the aircraft close to the runway, but unlike ILS, LNAV-VNAV is imprecise and has a lateral accuracy of 0.3 nautical miles. Therefore, pilots must be able to visually see the runway at their decision altitude before landing. If they can't see the runway at their minimum altitude, they have to turn around and try again. As they approached the runway, the pilots extended the landing gear and immediately another warning sounded in the cockpit. This warning told the pilots that the landing gear was not fully down and that they needed to take immediate action. On hearing this sound, the pilots are trained to act instinctively to check and resolve the problem. After going through the checklist, they found that the gear was indeed down and that it was a false alarm. This was a significant distraction for the pilots, who were already under a heavy workload. At the time, the aircraft was traveling at 3 to 4 miles per minute. With all the instrument failures and incorrect gear alerts, the pilots weren't able to stabilize the aircraft for landing, so they decided to go around and try again. The turn brought the aircraft back up to 2,000 feet, and the pilots then contacted the New York departure controller. 4 right, maintain 2,000, heading 101, heavy. Thank you. Contact from right, heading 180. AL 3011. The crew then informed the controller that they needed longer hold vectors to try to resolve the problems they were experiencing and that they were not yet ready for a second attempt at landing. And 101, could we have longer vectors? We're also having some instrument problems. Was that the reason for the go? Yes, because we lost the localizer and our minima changed, and there were a lot of problems, so we're trying to sort that out to see if we can continue with this approach at all. Now, to understand what happens next, you'll need to understand what a cloud ceiling is. A cloud ceiling is the height at which the lowest part of the clouds is above the ground. It tells pilots at what height above the ground they can start to see the ground. If the aircraft had a working ILS and the ability to auto-land, the pilots could land the aircraft at a cloud ceiling of 0 feet. However, because these pilots were making a non-precision approach, they needed to visually see the runway to ensure they were landing in the right place. and for that they needed a minimum ceiling of 600 feet. JFK had a ceiling of 200 feet. Their alternate airports of Newark and Stewart were also at 200 feet. Okay, well, right now the weather I have is showing ceiling 200 at Kennedy. The RVR is 4,500, so that's a little bit better. Visibility is good, but the problem we're having is with the ceiling because we can't continue with the ILS with a ceiling of 200 because every time we try to lock onto the localizer, the instrumentation doesn't allow us to do that. Okay, so you can't do like an auto land or anything. No, Autoland is not available because both we've got two radio altimeter failures, so we're on one radio altimeter. We've got TCAS failures. We've all got multiple instrument failures. So what ceiling do you need? You know, anything above about 600 or so. Okay, I got it. Okay, I get it now. Just fly heading 220. Let me find some weather, pull up some weather, and let me find something. Okay, thanks. The other problem the pilots had was that they wanted to conserve any remaining fuel so that they could make multiple go-arounds if they had to. This meant they had to land at an airport near New York and couldn't fly further out to Boston or Washington to land there. And just before I go, what was your potential alternate? The primary alternate was Newark, and the secondary alternate is Stewart, but both seem to be, in the same sort of situation. They were running out of fuel and starting to use their reserves. The extra 800 kilos they had loaded in Delhi were now proving useful. 11 heavy, I'm having trouble finding anything that's really that good. I got Albany, 600-foot ceiling, overcast, and Boston Logan would be 500 overcast. I'm trying to find Washington. Dallas is also 200 feet. We're just checking Boston as well because we're getting a little low on fuel as well, so we need to decide quickly, and we're burning quite a bit higher if we can burn a little less fuel, and then I think Pittsburgh is 2,500. Or 2,500? We just have to check the fuel. As far as 10211 heavy, climb and maintain 6,000. CL maintain 6,101 heavy. I think based on the weather that we have in the area and based on the forecast that I'm seeing, I think the Bradley Bravo Kilo Bravo Delta Lima is your best option. Okay. And, what's the ceiling there? Okay, right now, the ceiling there is 500 overcast. Got it. The ceiling at JFK is also improving a bit. I can try a VNAV approach. Okay. And see, if it can get us down in a situation like this because we're really, stuck and there's no fuel. And I'm showing Newark just had a special and they're showing 400 overcast. They just had a special at 125Z, so about 6 minutes ago. Okay, so it's a bit better now in Newark. Is that right? Yeah, sorry, the weather came up, just 400 feet. Overcast. Door, the departure controller, then informed the pilots of a new special meter issued by Newark, which showed that the ceiling had risen to 400 feet. The pilots decided to attempt to land at Newark with a ceiling of 400 feet. Remember, this was still lower than the 600 feet they had originally wanted, so they were not out of the woods yet. Okay, so you want to do the VAV approach into Newark, is that right? That's right. That's the only option we have because, this is unpredictable because every time we turn towards the localizer, it's just gone. Okay, so your ILS is out of service on both sides of the aircraft, right? That's correct. And then you said the radar alt are also out on both sides of the aircraft. That's right. We're on a single radio now. At this point, the aircraft had only about 7,200 kilograms of fuel left, just enough to complete the trip. Other than both ILSs, both radar altimeters, what else failed on the aircraft? Single-source radio altimeter. We've got TAS failure, no auto land, wind system, auto speed brake, and the ATIS inoperative as well. And in a grim reminder to the pilots of how precarious their position was, the controller asked them, 1, so when you get a chance, Give me the people on board and the fuel on board, please. We have 370 people and 7,200 kilograms of fuel. The pilots were then handed over to the Newark approach controller, who cleared them for the four-right approach. 11 heavy, 1 mile to go. Turn right 010, maintain, clear approach. The controller then scrambled the emergency vehicles in case assistance was needed after the plane landed. Heavy rescue. While we wait here, nature of emergency is a computer failure. Aircraft type is a Boeing 777 Whiskey model. 270 souls on board and 72,000 kilos of fuel. At this point, the crew had been flying for over 14 hours in a highly stressful environment, trying to land a massive, fully loaded aircraft in one of the busiest air corridors in the world without all the usual instruments. On top of that, all they could see outside the cockpit were clouds. With each passing minute, the pilots hoped the clouds would clear and they would be able to see the runway below as the plane continued to descend. And when they passed 1,000 feet, the plane was higher than their ideal descent path required, and if this wasn't corrected immediately, the plane would have to go around a second time, using more fuel that they didn't have. Captain Paya corrected this by pushing the plane's nose down to get it back on the ideal path, but this caused the plane to speed up even more. At one point, the controllers saw a warning on their screens that the plane was too low to the ground, and they passed it on to the pilots. At 400 feet, they finally broke through the clouds and saw that they were too high and to the right of where they needed to be. Captain Paya corrected the flight by pushing the nose down and to the left to bring the plane in line with the center line. Finally, after 15 hours in the air, the plane landed safely on runway 4 right at Newark. Emergency services then contacted the pilots to ask if they needed any assistance, but the pilots refused. 10 minutes after landing, as they were taxiing to the gate, a thunderstorm hit the entire airport. If the crew had delayed their approach by 5 minutes or had to make a second go-around, they would never have been able to land. Unfortunately, the cause of these numerous instrument failures remains unknown, as neither an incident report nor an investigation report has been released by Air India. However, one prevailing hypothesis is that the aircraft's main computer, which controls the flight engineering, diagnostic, and maintenance systems, malfunctioned, giving the pilots inaccurate readings. Despite being a crew of 4 who had not previously worked together, the pilots demonstrated commendable crew resource management by coordinating effectively with each other and with air traffic control, ultimately ensuring the safe landing of the aircraft. The aircraft was ferried back to India the following day for relocation.